Saul Alvarez, a name that today is synonymous with Mexican boxing, with precision, with toughness, with discipline. But this story does not begin under the bright lights of an arena in Las Vegas, nor with gold belts wrapped around a waist. It begins much earlier, in a place where dreams are not born easily. Saul Alvarez was born on July 18, 1990, in San Agustin, a small village in the Mexican state of Jalisco. He was the youngest of 8 siblings. The Alvarez family was not wealthy. Life revolved around work, responsibility, and survival. His father worked hard. His mother took care of the household, and the children were taught from a young age that nothing comes for free. In Mexico, especially in rural areas, you quickly learn one thing: either you endure, or life will run you over. Boxing was not the original plan. It was not his parents' dream. It was not a vision of fame. Boxing came as an accident that turned into an obsession. His older brother Rigoberto boxed as an amateur, and young Saul often watched him. He watched him train, watched him come home tired, beaten up, but with a sense of pride. And right there, something changed. It wasn't about becoming famous. It was about proving that he could endure more than the others. When Saul first stepped into a gym, he was no prodigy. He was a small, red-haired kid, a target of ridicule. The nickname Canelo, Cinnamon, was born right then, not as a brand, but as a joke. In Mexico, red-haired boys don't fit the stereotype of a boxer, and that made him an outsider before he had even had the chance to prove anything. But he had one thing that cannot be taught: stubbornness, the ability to absorb pain without complaining. When others dropped out, he stayed. When others slowed down, he pushed harder. The training wasn't technical, it was raw. A lot of bag work, a lot of sparring, very little comfort. Boxing in Mexico is not a game, it's a filter. It separates those who want it from those who are serious about it. Even as a child, he worked. He helped his family, sold ice pops, did small jobs. That experience taught him to value every opportunity. When training came, he didn't see it as an obligation. He saw it as a chance. And right here, his mentality began to form. No excuses, no shortcuts. His amateur career came quickly, and it was short, but intense. Saul Alvarez had over 40 amateur fights, winning most of them. Even then, it was clear he had a natural sense of distance. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the most mobile, but he could read opponents. He could wait, and he could land with unexpected power for his age dot at just 13 years old. He won the Mexican Junior Championship, and that's when the decision came that changed his entire life. While most boxers his age were still gathering experience in the amateurs, Saul decided to turn professional. He was 15 years old. 15. This decision wasn't romantic. It was pragmatic. His family needed money, and he knew boxing was the path. Not a safe one, not a guaranteed one, but the only one he could see. In Mexico, professional boxing is often the last way out of poverty, and Canelo understood that reality very early. When he signed his first professional contract, he wasn't physically ready. He wasn't technically complete, but he was mentally prepared. He was ready to take punches, to learn on the fly, and to carry a responsibility that most boys his age couldn't even comprehend. This moment marks the end of childhood and the beginning of the fight, not for titles, not for fame, but for survival in a professional world that does not forgive mistakes. Saul Alvarez's entry into professional boxing was not a fairy tale. It wasn't guided by a major promoter. It wasn't planned as a long-term project. It was a fight for every bout, for every paycheck, for every opportunity. Canelo fought often, sometimes twice a month. Opponents changed at the last minute. Weights changed. Conditions were far from ideal. But this period shaped him more than anything else. It's important to understand the context. A 15-year-old boy, without a fully developed body, without experience with the professional pace, stepping into a world where grown men stand across from him. Men who have boxed for 10, 15 years. Men who make a living by punishing mistakes. And Canelo made plenty of them. His guard wasn't perfect. His footwork was raw. His defense was based more on instinct than on a system. But he had something that frightened opponents: composure. Even when he took shots, he didn't panic. Even when he was hit, he didn't lose structure. And most importantly, his punches hurt, not because he had freakish power, but because he landed clean, precisely in the right places. The early years of his professional career were about learning on the job. Every fight was a lesson. Every opponent presented a different problem. Some pressured, some ran, some fought dirty, and Canelo absorbed it all, quietly, without theatrics, without drama. Even then, it was clear he wasn't an impulsive fighter. He wasn't the type to rush headlong into exchanges. He observed, he waited, and gradually, he began to develop what would later become his signature: counterpunching. Not speed, but timing. Not volume, but accuracy. As the number of wins grew, so did the pressure. The media noticed the young red-haired Mexican who kept winning and looked unusually mature. The nickname Canelo stopped being a joke. It became a brand, and with that came responsibility. He was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for his family, for his name, for expectations. The turning point came in 2011, when he earned a shot at the WBC Super Welterweight World title against Matthew Hatton. Too many people. He was still too young, too inexperienced. But that night, he showed he was ready. He wasn't perfect, but he was calm, controlled. He won by decision and became a world champion at 20 years old. That belt changed everything. He was no longer just a talent. He was a champion. And right there, the next phase of his career began. The phase where you must learn to win as the favorite, where every opponent comes prepared, where you are no longer the hunter, but the prey. Canelo began defending his title, and with every defense, his confidence grew. His style sharpened. His defense improved. He began to work more with his upper body, with head movement, with subtle slips. He didn't run. He didn't bounce away. He stayed in range, and he punished mistakes. At the same time, the first doubts appeared. Critics said he was cherry-picking opponents, that he was avoiding the most dangerous ones. And it was precisely this criticism that led to the decision that would catapult him into global superstardom. Floyd Mayweather, a fight that came too early, and at the same time, at exactly the right moment. Canelo was young, strong, confident, but standing across from him was a man who embodied defensive perfection. That fight was a lesson, a harsh one, relentless. Mayweather dissected him. He showed him what true ring IQ really means. After the loss to Floyd Mayweather, Saul Alvarez found himself at a point that breaks many careers: a public defeat, being exposed, being placed against the ideal of boxing perfection, and having your limits revealed. For some fighters, this is the end of illusions. For Canelo, it was the beginning of real work. He realized one fundamental thing: if he wanted to remain relevant long-term, he couldn't rely on strength and talent alone. He had to become a complete boxer. And right here, his career began to turn toward greatness. The move up to middleweight wasn't just a physical shift. It was a mental admission that his body was growing, getting stronger, and that he needed new challenges. It was no longer about what the scale said. It was about who was standing in front of him. Middleweight at that time was a division full of hungry, tough, uncompromising fighters. Canelo began to rely more on body work. He stopped chasing knockouts. He started systematically breaking opponents down. Body shots, patient pressure, step by step. Not an explosion, but erosion. Fights against boxers like Miguel Cotto weren't just sporting events. They were symbols. Mexico versus Puerto Rico, tradition versus tradition. And in those moments, Canelo showed that he could carry the weight of an entire nation's expectations. He defeated Cotto and became the king of the middleweight division. Not a young champion, but a man inheriting a legacy. But every legend needs a rival, and his arrived. Gennady Golovkin. Golovkin wasn't just a boxer. He was a myth, unstoppable, a destroyer, a man who crushed opponents without mercy. And most importantly, in the eyes of the public, He was the fighter Canelo had avoided for a long time. Whether that was reality or a media narrative, the pressure was immense. When the first fight finally happened, it wasn't just a clash of two champions. It was a collision of philosophies. Golovkin moved forward. Always pressure, jab, power. Canelo worked off counters, head movement, body work, calm eyes. That fight was a war of details. Every round was a microscopic battle for inches, for tempo, for breath. And the result? A draw. Controversial, divisive, a robbery to some, justice to others. But more important than the verdict was the fact that Canelo survived. Not only survived, he was competitive. Against a man no one before had been able to stop. The second battle was different. Canelo changed his approach. He went forward. He accepted the fight. He showed that he was no longer just a technician, but also a fighter unafraid of confrontation. Pressure against pressure, strength against strength. And this time, he won. That fight permanently changed the perception of his career. He was no longer protected, no longer a product. He was a warrior who had faced the greatest threat of his era. At the same time, criticism grew. Tests, clenbuterol, suspension, Mexican meat, a scandal that could have destroyed everything. And it was here that another layer of Canelo's personality emerged. Instead of collapsing, stubbornness, a return, a rematch, a victory. Canelo learned to live with the fact that he would never be loved by everyone, and he accepted it. He stopped trying to please. He started boxing for legacy. His style continued to evolve. Defense became his signature. Upper body movement, micro movements, blocks that look simple, but are the result of thousands of hours. He was no longer a young predator. He was a surgeon, and it was in this period that his ability to adapt to the absolute elite was born. Every opponent received a different plan, a different rhythm, a different kind of pressure. Canelo became the kind of boxer who forces you to fight his fight. Fans were divided. Some worshipped him, others questioned him, but no one could ignore him. Every one of his fights was an event. Every decision he made was analyzed. And it was right here that the chapter began that would take him even higher. Not just as a champion of one division, but as a man who wanted to conquer multiple divisions. A man who stopped choosing the path of least resistance. At a certain point in every great champion's career, a question appears, one with no easy answer. Is this enough, or do I want more? For Saul Alvarez, that question came in a moment when he already had titles in multiple weight classes, defeated legends, and rivalries that defined an entire generation. And that was when he made the decision that would write his name into history forever. Super middleweight, a division that for years had no clear ruler. For belts, for champions, no true king, and Canelo saw it, not as chaos, but as opportunity. Step in, take everything. Leave as the undisputed champion. That move was no accident. His body was mature, muscular, explosive. He no longer had to drain himself brutally. As super middleweight, he felt strong, stable, confident, and above all, in control. He knew that here, he could dictate the pace both physically and mentally. The first signal came with the fight against Callum Smith, a man taller, longer, on paper the ideal prototype for the division. But from the opening round, Canelo showed that height alone means nothing if you don't know how to use space. Smith was systematically dismantled, punch by punch, elbows pinned, hands dropping, no escape. Canelo destroyed his arms, his body, his psyche. It wasn't a knockout, it was dominant style with that fight. He made one thing clear, he didn't come to test the weight class. He came to rule it. Then came Billy Joe Saunders, a technical boxer, awkward, mobile, the type of opponent who makes a fight miserable by forcing you to chase him. And here, Canelo showed his patience. He didn't rush. He didn't lose structure. He waited for one single moment, and when it came, he ended the fight with one punch, literally, a broken orbital bone, over. That moment symbolized his entire approach. He doesn't waste energy. He doesn't gamble. He waits for a mistake, and he punishes it to the maximum. And then came Caleb Plant, the final piece of the puzzle. Undefeated, confident, fast. The media war was intense. Emotions, pressure, ego versus ego. But in the ring, the difference between those who talk and those who know was clear. Plant was technical. He was fast, but he wasn't ready for constant pressure, for body shots, for a physical presence that forces you backward even when you don't want to go. Canelo broke him later than many expected. but all the more clearly, a knockout that closed one of the greatest chapters of modern boxing. Canelo Alvarez became the first undisputed super middleweight champion in the four-belt era history. At that moment, he was at the absolute peak, not only athletically, but commercially as well. He was the face of boxing, a man who chooses his opponents, a man who dictates terms. And it's precisely here that even the greatest begin to ask where their limits lie. The next step was logical. Light heavyweight, another division, another challenge, another belt. The fight against Dmitry Bivol wasn't about a title. It was about ambition, about testing boundaries, about whether brilliance can overcome physics. And here, reality arrived. Bivol wasn't just bigger. He was disciplined, fast, consistent. He didn't make mistakes. And Canelo, for the first time in a long time, had no answer. Not that he was destroyed, but he was controlled. His pressure was neutralized. His punches lost their effect. His tempo was red. The loss wasn't brutal, but it was clear, and that's exactly why this defeat is crucial for understanding Canelo's career. It showed that even the most complete boxer has limits. That size, when paired with technique, can't always be bypassed, and that the courage to step beyond your comfort zone sometimes means paying a price. After the defeat to Dmitry Bivol, the atmosphere around Saul Alvarez changed. Not dramatically, not hysterically, but noticeably. For the first time in a long while, he was no longer seen as the man who had an answer for everything. For the first time, the question appeared, the one every long-reigning champion inevitably faces. Is this the beginning of the end, or just another chapter? Canelo returned to where he felt strongest, to super middleweight, not as a defeated man, but as someone who understood the limits of the experiment. The rematch with Golovkin came at a moment when both men were boxing more with history than with illusions. The third fight wasn't a war like the previous ones. It was a strategic duel. Control, calm, respect for age and wear. Canelo won, but you could feel an era closing. He was no longer a hungry hunter. He was a guardian of a legacy. And right at this point, his motivation began to change. Before, he chased challenges to prove he belonged among the elite. Now he chose fights so they made sense long-term, physically, mentally, and commercially. The fight with John Ryder was symbolic, a return to Mexico, home, in front of his own people. Ryder wasn't a media star. It wasn't a legacy fight, but he was a tough, awkward opponent, and those kinds of fights often reveal more than big names. Canelo broke him down, systematically, without emotion, like a professional who knows when to press and when to ease off. He won clearly, but more important than the result was the feeling. Control was back. Then came Jermall Charlo, a clash of two champions, and also a fight that showed the reality of modern boxing. The weight difference, the risk, the calculation. Charlo was an excellent boxer at his weight, but against Canelo he looked smaller, more cautious, tied up by respect, and Canelo took advantage of it, not through aggression, but through intelligence. He won without chaos, without unnecessary exchanges. Like a man who no longer needs to prove something with every punch. The criticism came immediately. Fans wanted more. They wanted blood. They wanted drama. But Canelo was no longer at the stage of his career where he risks unnecessarily. He understood that the biggest opponent isn't the man across from him. It's time. And time became the main theme of this phase of his life. Recovery, injuries, fatigue. Every training camp had to mean something. Every fight had to be a reason for the body to go through war again. He no longer fought often. He fought strategically. At the same time, his business side opened up more and more. Canelo was no longer just an athlete. He was a brand. Investments, real estate, gas stations, products, partnerships. His name worked outside the ring, too, and that gave him freedom. He didn't have to take every fight. He didn't have to chase every belt. But freedom brings a different kind of pressure. The pressure of legacy, the pressure of decisions that will define you in hindsight. Fans in Mexico adored him, but they were also unforgiving. Every step he took was compared to the legends of the past. Chavez, Morales, Barrera. Those men were symbols of war, heart, blood. Canelo was a symbol of control, precision, professionalism, and not everyone accepted that the same way. As he got older, Canelo began to focus more on family, on stability. He was no longer the kid who needed to prove to the world that he had it. He was a man protecting what he was putting on the line, his body and his mind. And yet the fire was still there. Not the wild kind, the quiet kind. The fire of a man who knows his career is approaching the point where every next fight closes something, not opens it. That's when people started talking about the biggest names, about fights that aren't necessary, but are meaningful, about that wouldn't be about a belt, but about history. And one name began to repeat more and more often: Terrence Crawford, a name that instantly created tension in every boxing circle. Fans all over the world began to speculate. What kind of fight would it be? How would Canelo match up against one of the smartest and most complete boxers of the modern era? The media went crazy. Sports books shifted odds every few hours. Every sentence either man said in interviews went viral instantly. A fight was being prepared that wasn't just about a belt, but about legacy, history, and who would remain in boxing's memory. Canelo began preparing in a completely different way than ever before. It wasn't just about physical conditioning anymore, not just sparring and tactical drills. It was about every detail, every hand movement, every timing cue, every shadow punch in the gym. His team analyzed every Crawford fight, every step, every micro moment in his stance when he changed the angle of his punches or slipped pressure. They knew Crawford was a master of adaptation, that he reads opponents faster than most fighters, and that any small detail Canelo overlooked could mean defeat. Fans split into two camps: those who believed Canelo, the experienced veteran, could overcome a younger, hungrier, technically brilliant Crawford, and those who saw the logic in Crawford's style, mobility, precision, the ability to adjust. The tension reached its maximum. Every interview, every sparring clip, every statement spread instantly across social media. Mexico stood behind Canelo, knowing this might be his last chance to leave an unquestionable legacy, and the world watched. His every move, training entered a new dimension. Canelo hired analysts who prepared simulations, charts, and videos capturing every Crawford weakness, whether it was a slight weight shift, a tiny slowdown in defensive phases after the 10th round, or the way Crawford avoided heavy pressure near the corner. Canelo understood that physical ability was no longer the only way to win. He had to be mentally one step ahead, to read punches before they arrived. Every day became an absolute regime of boxing war. Morning sparring, strength work, recovery, diet, visualizing the fight, watching every Crawford video from the last 5 years, every detail that could make the difference between victory and defeat. And at the same time, Canelo learned to keep calm and natural, because he knew Crawford would exploit any sign of nerves instantly. The hype grew by the day. Ticket lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Pay-per-view records were being broken even before fight night. The media compared their pasts non-stop. Canelo as a multi-division legend, Crawford as a technical genius who had never lost to a man he couldn't decode. The psychological war began before the first bell. Every statement, every photo, every look into the camera was analyzed out, and then fight day arrived. The atmosphere was electric. Every look at Canelo's focus in the ring, every movement from Crawford, every punch or sidestep carried a weight beyond boxing itself. Every round felt like a lesson in strategy, psychology, and physical perfection. Canelo showed that his experience and toughness weren't just words. Every brutal knockout he'd scored before, every bad night, every wave of media pressure had prepared him for this exact moment. Crawford was dangerous. His speed and opponent treating were phenomenal. But Canelo had one advantage forged over decades: the ability to endure, to adapt, to switch styles, to use ring psychology and crowd pressure as fuel, not weakness. And because of that, every punch he threw had purpose. Every step, every acceleration and slowdown, every change of angle was part of a perfectly calculated strategy, combining mental readiness, technical brilliance, and the historical awareness that this fight was no longer just about him, but about an entire generation of boxing. Fans understood this wasn't just a fight, it was a chapter of history, and Saul Alvarez stood in the center of it, ready to write another legendary page of his life. When we look back at Canelo's career today, it's clear his legacy goes beyond wins and belts. It isn't just boxing statistics, or the number of titles, or the number of defenses. It's the complete portrait of a man who changed how boxing is seen, who proved that hard work, mental toughness, and the ability to learn can overcome any talent that isn't perfect on its own. Canelo became a symbol of adaptability in every weight class, against every style, against every opponent who ever stood on the other side of the ring. He managed to combine physical dominance with tactically brilliant decisions, with a psychological strategy that often overcame even the smartest opponents. Fans, analysts, and historians agree his importance can't be measured only by titles. His career is a textbook on how to combine business instinct, media image, and sporting mastery. His fights weren't just about the ring, they were about preparation, planning, reading opponents, reacting in milliseconds. Every step, every punch, every decision in the gym and in the ring showed his ability to stay one step ahead, not only physically, but mentally. Canelo became an inspiration for new generations of fighters who now understand that success isn't only about talent, but about discipline, the courage to take risks, and the mental strength to survive even the biggest falls and controversies. His journey from the poor streets of Jalisco, through his first amateur bouts, his first professional success, through epical battles with Mayweather, Golovkin, Plant, Bivol, and then Crawford, all of it together forms the image of a boxer whose career will be analyzed for decades, perhaps centuries. And finally, when we look at his later years, at the super middleweight run, the unification, the determination to always take on the biggest challenges, it's clear that Canelo Alvarez isn't just a boxer. He is the definition of a modern legend, a man who changed the game, set new standards, and proved that true greatness isn't only about how many belts you hold, but about how to become an icon people remember, not just for your victories, but for the way you fought, prepared, and lived. Canelo Alvarez, a name written forever into boxing history, a symbol of courage, precision, and the relentless desire to be better than yesterday. And no matter how his story ends, whether his final punches come under the bright lights, one thing is certain: Canelo left a mark that will be incredibly difficult for anyone else to surpass.